The pre-dawn darkness over the Soviet frontier shattered at 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, as thousands of German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along a front stretching over 2,000 kilometers from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, their thunderous barrage marking the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union that Adolf Hitler had conceived as the decisive campaign to secure Lebensraum for the German people, to destroy Judeo-Bolshevism at its source, and to establish German dominance over the Eurasian landmass through military conquest that would be accomplished in weeks, or at most months, before the Soviet political system collapsed under the weight of German military superiority and before the harsh Russian winter could impede operations. 3.5 years later, as Soviet forces raised the red flag over the ruins of the Reichstag in Berlin, while Hitler's charred corpse smoldered in a shell crater in the Reich Chancellery Garden, the catastrophic consequences of Barbarossa's failure had become undeniable. The operation that was supposed to secure Germany's future had instead guaranteed its destruction, had committed the Wehrmacht to a war of attrition against an enemy with greater population and industrial resources than Germany could match, had created the two-front war that German strategic planning had always sought to avoid, and had revealed that Hitler's ideological convictions about Soviet weakness and racial inferiority were not strategic insights, but were rather delusions that led Germany into the greatest military disaster in its history, and that would ultimately ensure the total destruction of the Nazi regime, and the Reich it had promised would last 1,000 years. Operation Barbarossa became Hitler's greatest mistake, not because the initial invasion failed tactically. German forces achieved stunning operational successes in the summer and fall of 1941, advancing hundreds of kilometers, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies, and capturing millions of prisoners in battles that seemed to validate German military superiority. But because the entire strategic conception of the operation was based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about Soviet military capabilities, about the resilience of the Soviet political system, about the timeline within which decisive victory could be achieved, and about Germany's capacity to sustain prolonged warfare against an enemy whose resources exceeded German capabilities in nearly every relevant category. The decision to invade the Soviet Union while Britain remained undefeated and while the United States was providing increasing material support to Germany's enemies guaranteed that Germany would eventually face the multi-front war that its strategic position made unsustainable, violated the principle of concentration of force that had guided successful German operations in Poland and France, and committed Germany to achieving objectives that were beyond its military and industrial capacity to accomplish within the time frame that strategic necessity required. The ideological foundations of Barbarossa shaped the operations planning in ways that prevented realistic assessment of what the campaign would actually require and what the consequences of failure would mean for Germany's strategic position. Hitler's racial theories insisted that Slavic peoples were inferior and incapable of the sophisticated organization required for modern warfare, that the Soviet political system was inherently brittle and would collapse once subjected to serious military pressure, and that the German racial ideological superiority would manifest itself in battlefield dominance that would overcome any material disadvantages Germany might face. These beliefs were not merely background assumptions, but were central to operational planning. The timeline for completing Barbarossa before winter was based on expectations that Soviet resistance would collapse quickly. The logistics preparations were inadequate for prolonged operations because planners assumed brief campaign duration, and the political military strategy focused on destroying Soviet armies in border battles rather than on systematic occupation and control of territory. Because the assumption was that Soviet political collapse would follow military defeats and would make extended occupation unnecessary. The intelligence failures that preceded Barbarossa were products of this ideological framework, preventing accurate assessment of Soviet capabilities. German intelligence had dramatically underestimated Soviet industrial capacity, particularly in tank and aircraft production, had failed to identify the industrial relocations that were moving Soviet factories beyond German reach even before the invasion began, and had miscalculated Soviet mobilization potential by failing to understand that totalitarian systems, while repressive, could also be extremely effective at mobilizing populations for total war. The intelligence about Soviet military deployments was more accurate regarding force positions, but was interpreted through frameworks that assumed Soviet forces would be easily defeated despite their numerical strength, that Soviet command and control would collapse under pressure, and that the Red Army's tactical incompetence, which was real in 1941 due to Stalin's purges having eliminated experienced commanders, would be permanent, rather than being a temporary condition that would be corrected through battlefield learning and through Stalin's eventual willingness to delegate authority to competent military professionals. The operational planning for Barbarossa revealed tensions between military logic and ideological objectives that were never successfully resolved, and that contributed to the campaign's ultimate failure. The military professionals planning the invasion understood that concentrating German forces toward a single decisive objective would offer the best prospects for achieving breakthrough and for destroying Soviet military power before it could be fully mobilized. But they disagreed about what that objective should be. Some argued for concentrating on Moscow as the Soviet political and transportation center whose capture would decapitate Soviet command and control. Others advocated for economic targets like the Ukrainian grain production and Donbass industry, or the Caucasus oil fields, whose loss would cripple Soviet war-making capacity. Hitler's ideological framework led him to emphasize multiple objectives simultaneously. Leningrad, to eliminate the cradle of Bolshevism, Ukraine for its agricultural and industrial resources, and eventually Moscow as political center, creating a strategic approach that violated the principle of concentration and that dispersed German forces across such vast spaces that achieving decisive results at any single point became progressively more difficult. The three army groups that launched Barbarossa, Army Group North driving toward Leningrad, Army Group Center advancing toward Moscow, Army Group South pushing into Ukraine, each achieved remarkable initial successes that created illusion that the campaign was proceeding according to plan and that Soviet collapse was imminent. The encirclement battles at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev destroyed entire Soviet armies, captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and advanced German forces hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory in weeks. These tactical and operational successes were real and demonstrated Wehrmacht capabilities at their peak, but they also consumed time and resources while Soviet forces continued to appear in numbers that planning had not anticipated, while the vast distances of the Soviet Union made each advance create longer supply lines that German logistics struggled to sustain, and while the approaching winter created timeline pressures that made the gap between achievement and objectives progressively more apparent. The encirclements that seemed to demonstrate German superiority also revealed patterns that should have warned planners that the campaign was not proceeding as assumed. The surrounded Soviet forces often fought with determination that delayed their elimination, consuming German time and forces that were needed for continuing the advance. The prisoners captured in these massive battles numbered in hundreds of thousands, but represented forces that Soviet mobilization was replacing with new armies that, while less experienced and often poorly equipped initially, demonstrated that Soviet manpower reserves exceeded German estimates. Most troublingly, the destruction of Soviet forces in border battles did not trigger the political collapse that ideology had predicted. The Soviet system proved resilient rather than brittle. Stalin maintained control despite catastrophic military setbacks, and Soviet resistance continued, and in some ways intensified, rather than weakening as the invasion progressed. The decision in late July and August 1941 to divert forces from the drive toward Moscow to support operations in Ukraine, demonstrated the consequences of the dispersed strategic approach that ideological objectives had created. From a purely military perspective focused on destroying Soviet capability to resist, Moscow represented the most valuable objective. It was the political capital, the center of Soviet transportation networks, the symbolic heart of the communist system whose fall might trigger broader collapse. But Hitler's emphasis on economic objectives and his conviction that capturing Ukrainian resources was essential for sustaining German war effort led him to order forces diverted southward at precisely the moment when concentration toward Moscow might have achieved breakthrough before winter. The resulting Kiev encirclement was tactically brilliant and captured over 600,000 Soviet prisoners, but it consumed the time that would have been needed to reach Moscow before winter conditions made such operations impossible. The renewed drive toward Moscow, beginning in October 1941, Operation Typhoon, came too late in the season, and after German forces had been weakened by months of continuous combat without adequate replacement of losses in men and equipment. The autumn rains turned roads to mud that immobilized German vehicles and that created logistical nightmares as supplies could not reach forward units. By the time ground froze in late November and mobility was partially restored, winter conditions were setting in and German forces were within kilometers of Moscow but lacked the strength to achieve the breakthrough that might have captured the city. The December Soviet counteroffensive, launched by forces that German intelligence had not known existed and commanded by General Georgy Zhukov, who demonstrated operational competence that contradicted assumptions about Soviet military incompetence, drove German forces back from Moscow's approaches and ensured that Barbarossa's primary objective would not be achieved in 1941. The failure to capture Moscow before winter represented the point where Barbarossa's strategic conception was revealed as unworkable, where the assumptions about quick Soviet collapse were proven false, and where Germany found itself committed to exactly the kind of prolonged war of attrition in the East that strategic planning had sought to avoid. The decision Hitler made in December 1941 to issue stand-fast orders, forbidding retreats regardless of tactical situation, reflected his recognition that winter withdrawals might turn into routs comparable to Napoleon's 1812 retreat. But it also reflected his inability to accept that the campaign had failed to achieve its objectives and that fundamental strategic reassessment was necessary. The order to hold every position condemned German soldiers to defending exposed positions without adequate winter equipment, led to casualties from cold that rivaled combat losses, and established the pattern of Hitler overriding military judgment in favor of ideological rigidity that would characterize German operations in the East for the remainder of the war. The catastrophic inadequacy of German logistics for sustained operations in the Soviet Union revealed the planning failures that stemmed from assumptions about brief campaign duration. The railway system in the Soviet Union used different gauge tracks than European railways, requiring either conversion of tracks to German gauge or transfer of supplies at the frontier, both of which created bottlenecks that limited supply flows to advancing forces. German logistics had been designed to support operations measured in weeks across distances comparable to France, not operations measured in months across distances measured in thousands of kilometers. The result was that German forces advanced faster than supply lines could support, that critical supplies like fuel and ammunition became progressively scarce at the front, and that the combat effectiveness of German units declined from supply shortages even when they were not suffering heavy combat casualties. The winter equipment fiasco demonstrated the costs of planning based on assumption of quick victory. The decision not to prepare or distribute winter clothing for the army was based on expectation that the campaign would be concluded before severe winter conditions developed, that Moscow would fall in October, and that German forces would occupy defensive positions in territory where winter quarters could be prepared and where supply situation would be manageable. When these expectations proved false, German soldiers faced Russian winter in summer uniforms, dying of exposure in temperatures reaching -30 degrees Celsius, abandoning equipment that could not function in extreme cold, and losing combat effectiveness to weather as much as to enemy action. The improvised attempts to address winter equipment shortages by appealing to German civilian population for donations or by attempting to procure supplies from occupied territories could not compensate for the systematic lack of proper military winter equipment that resulted from planning failures. The occupation policies implemented in conquered Soviet territories revealed another dimension of how ideological objectives undermine strategic success. Nazi racial ideology mandated treatment of Slavic populations as subhuman, required implementation of genocidal policies against Jews and other targeted groups, and prevented the kind of political warfare that might have exploited genuine grievances against Stalin's regime to create collaborative resistance against Soviet power. There were populations in the Soviet Union, in Ukraine, in the Baltic states, in regions that had suffered under forced collectivization and political repression, that might have welcomed German forces as liberators from communist tyranny if German occupation had offered credible alternatives to Soviet rule. But the reality of Nazi occupation, systematic murder of Jews, brutal exploitation of civilian populations, treatment of Slavic peoples as expendable labor to be worked to death, ensured that even populations initially hostile to Soviet regime recognized that German occupation was worse and that resistance to Germany was necessary for survival. This self-inflicted wound transformed what might have been war between German military and Soviet government into war between Germany and Soviet peoples, mobilizing resistance that went far beyond what purely military factors would have created, and ensuring that German forces would face not just Red Army in combat, but also partisan warfare in rear areas that consumed forces needed at the front and that created security challenges throughout occupied territories. The potential strategic advantage of exploiting political divisions within Soviet society was sacrificed to ideological imperatives that made such exploitation impossible, demonstrating how Nazi ideology was not just morally catastrophic, but was also strategically incompetent in ways that contributed to German defeat. The economic calculations that had shaped Hitler's emphasis on capturing Soviet resources, Ukrainian grain, Donbass coal and industry, Caucasus oil, proved to be flawed in multiple ways. The resources existed and were valuable, but capturing the territory where they were located did not immediately translate into access to those resources for German use. Soviet forces implemented scorched earth policies, destroying industrial facilities and infrastructure before retreating, making captured territory less economically valuable than planning had assumed. The distances involved in transporting captured resources back to Germany or to German military forces created logistical challenges that limited the immediate utility of economic gains. Most fundamentally, the resources required to conquer and hold territory often exceeded the economic value derived from controlling it. Divisions committed to occupying captured Soviet territories and to defending against Soviet counteroffensives were divisions unavailable for other operations, and the costs in German lives and material of conquering Soviet space often exceeded the economic benefits derived from controlling that space. The progressive attrition of German military power during 1941–42 created a situation where Germany was fighting a war it could not win through military means alone. The casualties suffered during Barbarossa and the subsequent winter campaign eliminated experienced soldiers and officers who could not be adequately replaced, created a situation where German divisions were progressively weaker and less capable even when they nominally existed as organizational entities. The losses in equipment, tanks, vehicles, aircraft were partially replaced by German industry, but not at rates sufficient to keep pace with losses, and also to expand forces to the levels needed for the vast theatre that the Eastern Front represented. The Luftwaffe's progressive degradation from combat losses and from inadequate replacement aircraft meant that German air superiority that had characterized early operations was lost by 1942, creating conditions where Soviet air power would progressively assert itself in ways that affected ground operations. The strategic situation that emerged from Barbarossa's failure was exactly what German planning had sought to avoid: a two-front war where Germany faced enemies in multiple theaters whose combined resources exceeded German capacity to match. The failure to defeat the Soviet Union quickly meant that German forces would be committed to major operations in the East indefinitely, consuming the bulk of Wehrmacht combat power and preventing concentration against Britain or against American forces that were beginning to enter the war in 1942. The decision to declare war on the United States in December 1941, coming just as Barbarossa's failure was becoming apparent, guaranteed that Germany would face not just British and Soviet enemies but also American industrial might that would eventually prove decisive in determining war's outcome. The 1942 summer offensive, Operation Blue, aiming to capture Caucasus oil fields and Stalingrad, represented an attempt to achieve through renewed offensive what Barbarossa had failed to accomplish in 1941, but it was undertaken with forces weakened from the previous year's campaigns and was based on similar assumptions about Soviet weakness that had proven false in 1941. The decision to pursue dual objectives of Caucasus and Stalingrad simultaneously violated the principle of concentration that military logic suggested, but that Hitler's need to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously overrode. The result was progressive dispersion of German strength, vulnerability to Soviet counter-offensives that exploited weak sectors defended by unreliable Allied forces, and eventually the Stalingrad catastrophe, where an entire German army was encircled and destroyed in the kind of defeat that would have been unimaginable in 1941, but that by 1943 demonstrated how completely the correlation of forces had shifted against Germany. The Soviet Union's resilience and eventual military superiority emerged from factors that German planning had not adequately considered or had dismissed as insignificant. Soviet industrial capacity, once mobilized for war production and relocated beyond German reach, proved capable of producing weapons in quantities that exceeded German output in many categories. Soviet population reserves enabled replacement of catastrophic casualties and continuous fielding of forces that, while often poorly trained initially, gained experience and effectiveness over time. Soviet willingness to accept casualties at rates that would have broken other societies reflected both the totalitarian nature of Stalin's regime, which could compel sacrifice through terror, and genuine popular resistance to German invasion once Nazi occupation policies demonstrated their genocidal character. Most importantly, Soviet military learning from the disasters of 1941 to 42 created Red Army, that by 1943 to 44 could conduct sophisticated operations that rivaled or exceeded German capabilities, while also possessing material advantages that made such operations devastating in their effects. The institutional learning that occurred in the Red Army demonstrated that military competence was not inherently racial, as Nazi ideology insisted, but was rather product of experience, training, and organizational development that any society could achieve given time and resources. The Red Army of 1941 that was shattered by German invasion was led by officers who had survived Stalin's purges, often more through political reliability than military competence, was doctrinally confused about how to conduct modern warfare, and made tactical and operational errors that German forces ruthlessly exploited. But the Red Army of 1943 to 44 was led by commanders like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Konev, who demonstrated operational excellence, had developed sophisticated doctrines for breakthrough and exploitation, and could coordinate operations involving millions of soldiers across fronts spanning thousands of kilometers. This transformation revealed that the Soviet system was capable of institutional learning and adaptation that ideology had insisted communist Slavic organizations could not achieve. The geopolitical consequences of Barbarossa's failure extended beyond the immediate military defeat to reshape the entire post-war world in ways that served Soviet rather than German interests. The Red Army's advance westward from 1943 to 45 established Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe that would last for decades, created the Soviet sphere of influence that Stalin had sought, but that might not have been achievable if Barbarossa had succeeded in destroying Soviet power. The alliance between Western democracies and Soviet communism that Barbarossa helped cement through creating common enemy ensured that Germany would face combined resources of United States, Britain, and USSR that exceeded Axis capabilities by factors that made ultimate German defeat inevitable once Germany failed to achieve quick victory over the Soviets. The human costs of Barbarossa were catastrophic, on a scale that exceeded any previous military campaign. Soviet casualties, military and civilian combined, numbered over 20 million dead, a figure that reflected both the intensity of combat and the genocidal character of German occupation policies. German casualties in the East numbered in millions and represented losses that Germany could not replace, that progressively degraded Wehrmacht combat effectiveness, and that eventually left Germany unable to defend against Soviet offensives or against Allied invasion from the West. The Eastern Front became a meat grinder, consuming forces on both sides, but the asymmetry in resources meant that Soviet Union could sustain such losses, while Germany could not, making the attritional character of the campaign favor the Soviets once the initial German advantages from surprise and superior training were exhausted. The broader impact of Barbarossa on German strategic position was to commit Germany to a war that it could not win, while preventing concentration of forces against enemies that might have been defeated if German power had not been dispersed across multiple theaters. The debate about whether Germany might have defeated Britain if forces committed to Barbarossa had instead been concentrated against British positions in the Mediterranean, or if resources had been allocated to naval and air forces that might have won the Battle of the Atlantic is ultimately speculative. But it's clear that Barbarossa ensured that such alternatives were never tested because German military power was consumed in the East in pursuit of objectives that were not achieved, and at costs that guaranteed eventual German defeat. When Operation Barbarossa was launched on June 22, 1941, Hitler believed he was beginning the campaign that would secure Germany's future, establish German dominance over Europe, and validate the racial ideology that had driven Nazi policy from the beginning. Instead, he was launching the operation that would guarantee Germany's destruction, that would commit the Wehrmacht to an unwinnable war of attrition, that would create the two-front war that German strategy had always sought to avoid, and that would ultimately result in Soviet forces occupying Berlin and in the total destruction of the Nazi regime. Barbarossa became Hitler's greatest mistake, not because it failed tactically. The initial operations were brilliantly executed, but because the entire strategic conception was based on ideological delusions rather than realistic assessment, because the objectives exceeded Germany's capacity to achieve them within the time frame that strategic necessity required, and because the failure to achieve quick victory committed Germany to prolonged conflict against an enemy whose resources and resilience had been systematically underestimated by planning that was shaped more by racial theories than by military logic. The catastrophe that unfolded from June 1941 through May 1945 was not accidental or inevitable, but was rather the direct consequence of strategic decisions based on ideology rather than reality, demonstrating that Hitler's greatest mistake was not a tactical error or even a single strategic misjudgment, but was rather the entire framework of racial ideological thinking that made realistic strategic assessment impossible, and that led Germany to its destruction through pursuing objectives that were beyond its capacity to achieve against enemies whose capabilities had been dismissed through prejudice rather than accurately assessed through objective analysis.